the humanities programs all over the United States, essentially all over the world, are experiencing a serious crisis. Scholarium is really excited about promoting ideas across academia and the public sphere. This kind of dialogue, we feel, should be much more vibrant than it currently is, and we hope that Scholarium can facilitate this kind of dialogue and learning beyond academia. Another important goal we have is to provide a platform that stresses a continuing relevance and the crucial importance of the liberal arts and humanities and social sciences. Um, we also provide a platform for scholars to teach cool classes on a broad range of topics. So maybe a class that you always wanted to teach, but you couldn't really do it in a university setting. Scholarium could be a good place for you to teach those classes in a unique format, in a flexible way. We have various models for online and in-person teaching that include large-scale online courses, the type of Zoom courses that would look like something like this, just with probably a presentation, more specialized seminar scale courses that are usually confined to something like under 20 students, and also teaching in person locally in different institutions. We also have a Facebook page, a Facebook group that we'd love if you could join us. If someone could share the link to the Facebook group, that would be great. Just go in there, like the page, be part of the community, post stuff if you're interested in posting something, comment on our posts and other people's posts. This is supposed to be a group for people who are curious and eager to learn and teach and so forth. So I want to say a few words about Scholarium's monthly lecture series. As the name suggests, this will be a monthly lecture series that is free for everyone. These lectures are designed for people who are passionate about learning and want to be inspired by new ideas. And I'm sure that you'll experience that today. We're into cutting edge ideas. So these lectures will promote open, friendly, and fun discussion about cutting edge ideas that speakers will introduce. Before we start this lecture, I want to shortly just mention that next month's lecture will be given by Dr. Connor Wood, who will give a lecture on the natural history of music. What can be more universal than that and more interesting for so many people from so many different disciplines, right? This fascinating topic will eventually become a course that will be taught through Scholarium. In this lecture, Dr. Wood will survey the comparative study of music, drawing on diverse fields like cognitive science, anthropology, philosophy, so it's going to be a lot of fun. Jot down the date, Thursday, June 17th at 7 o'clock. Usually our monthly lectures will be on Thursday at this time. So practically a month from today, if I'm not mistaken, June 17th, 7 o'clock. And you have a link to that as well for anyone who wants to go to the website to sign up for that lecture. You can do it as soon as right now. And let's move on to today's lecture. So I'm really excited to introduce a really good friend and a colleague of many years, Dr. Paul Cassell. Dr. Cassell started his undergraduate career at MIT, majoring in astronautical engineering. How interesting is that? He had a dream to be an astronaut and a space shuttle pilot, but then kind of moved towards the more engineering side of that and wanted to become a payload specialist at MIT, but then felt that something is missing. He wanted more meaning, and he made this sharp turn towards the humanities, and he actually ended his undergraduate studies in UVA, in the University of Virginia, as an interdisciplinary Eccles scholar with minors in mathematics and religious studies. So first of all, this is already the beginning of his interdisciplinary path, where for the first time he could study things that are apparently as removed as mathematics and religious studies. So that's fascinating. He has a master's degree in secondary social studies education, focusing on American political theory. And he got his master's degree at UVA as well. His eclectic interests eventually led him to Boston University, where he was trained in the historical and theoretical interaction between science, philosophy, and religion. While pursuing his PhD, Dr. Cassell focused on semiotics, the origins of human language, emergence theory, we'll hear all about emergence today, and theory of religion. His dissertation and his first book that came out with Routledge is The Application of Emergence Theory. Emergence theory essentially is a method that investigates complex adaptive systems or intelligent adaptive processes like living things and human minds. And he applies these methods to the study of religion, just to give you a preview for this interdisciplinary project that he's engaged in. His current research explores the evolutionary, biological, and cultural roots of religion in human prehistory, going back to the Paleolithic, and as you'll see, even before that. He currently lives in Phoenix, Arizona, and teaches at ASU College of Integrative Science and Arts. He is married and has a 5-year-old son. So what we're going to do here today, Dr. Cassell is going to lecture for about 45 to 50 minutes, and it's going to be followed by Q&A, depending on how many questions you have. We have a lot of time, half an hour, 45 minutes after that. So I really encourage people throughout the lecture, jot down questions, write down questions that you have. So after Dr. Cassell lectures, we'll have time to engage in interesting dialogue. So with no further ado, Dr. Cassell, the floor, the screen is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good, great. Well, thank you so much. You know, I was talking with a colleague just before I came in here, and he said, what a joy to be able to talk about what you're most excited about. And I thought, you know, that's the right attitude for coming to an event like this. I've thought of a number of ways about what I wanted to present, what would be most interesting to the most people, because I know that we have a diverse group and I want it to be somewhat accessible to everybody. But I do need to say up front that this is a nerd thing, right? I'm the kind of person who gets excited about ideas and books, and I'll get depressed about something I read, and I'll get, there's all sorts of drama that goes on in my life as I'm engaging intellectual ideas. And I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but nevertheless, that's mine. And so I wanted to share kind of the twists and turns of the intellectual journey that I took, which you can see already was very interdisciplinary, covered a lot of material and a lot of ground, and kind of allow you access into the journey that I took, with the idea of it being something of an invitation to you. The only thing I'm going to be showing up on the screen, like PowerPoint and things like that, are going to be pictures of key books that actually changed my life, that turned the way I was thinking about something in an important way. And the point being, I think that the journey is everything, and I want to invite you into that journey as well. And if there's things that you find very interesting in this, wonderful. I'll have links at the end to where you can see, you can look up those books. You don't need to write anything down, in other words, while you're watching the lecture. So if I'm going to do this as a story, let me start by saying that I think all good stories start with a slap in the face, something that wakes us out of our slumber. Now, in my life, I've had a number of slaps in the face, intellectually and otherwise. And the slap in the face that I'm going to be talking about today is one that really challenged me in terms of what I think it means to be human. And the book that I'm talking about, I'm going to share it, actually. So this is my first share along these lines. Is a book by Richard Dawkins called The Selfish Gene. And Richard Dawkins is very famous now. He's sort of the Pope of science. He kind of represents science to a lot of people. And he can be a very polarizing figure. People love him and hate him. And one of the reasons that he has that stature and that power is that he speaks very powerfully on the topics that he focuses in on. He has a way about his style that is just it just cuts right to the chase. And what Dr. Dawkins is doing in this book that was such a slap to me was he was proposing a scientific account of what it means to be human. And it was an account that sort of said, we are nothing but. And that phrase, nothing but, is usually followed by whatever that scientist studies, right? We are nothing but X or Y or Z. But for Dr. Dawkins, we are nothing but replicating genes that create our bodies and our brains, and replicating memes. And Dr. Dawkins actually coins the term memes in this book. We've all heard of memes, this meme on YouTube or whatever. That word was invented in this book, The Selfish Gene, and it was meant to capture the idea of some idea or snippet of a song or thought that just replicates itself. It spreads like a virus, and it goes around to different people, and soon everybody's sort of mimicking that. But the point was, so that was the kind of the picture that he's painting in this book. Human beings are nothing but genes and memes, these self-replicating things. But it wasn't just the specific details, but it was the attitude by which he's communicating in this book that was so powerfully affecting me. And what he was communicating is what a scientific account of what it means to be human should look like, what it should and shouldn't include. It should be about mechanisms and unthinking processes that unfold in unvarying ways. It should exclude things like hopes and dreams and mind and purposes, intentions and values and desires. On the view that he was developing in that book, we don't evaluate or have any active role in our behavior, but we are merely the sum of unconscious, mindless stuff that inevitably follows the rules. So there's no meaning, no larger picture, no freedom of choice, no choosing self. Now, I wrestled with this book for days, mainly because it was so convincing. It was not that it was so weak and stupid, it was that it was so powerful and had he was dealing with things in a way that earned my respect. But it really bothered me. Is that what it really means to be human? And then something occurred to me, and this is kind of the key pivot that ends up setting the entire course of my career. I thought to myself, well, let's say that Dr. Dawkins is right. Let's say it's true that what we are physically and mentally is a result of mindless, purposeless replicators. Well, now that we know that fact, it's something that we can now use for our own purposes and our own ends. And I asked myself, who would I bet on? The mindless, determined, unconscious bits that make us up, that have to do what they must, or the being who figures out those things about those bits and then turns around and uses that knowledge for its own ends? And I felt like this gave me a handle on something that I wanted to try to understand. Whatever we can determine about ourselves under the sort of framework of the sciences, no matter how kind of anti-human it looks, it becomes something that we can know once we've done it. And it's something that we can use once we've done it. So whatever we picture ourselves as, and to the degree that we do correctly identify those aspects of our being that are falling under these strict kind of scientific rules and regulations, so to speak, once we know that fact, that becomes our tool for us to do with what we want. And if there's anything that I wanted to understand about what it means to be human, it occurred to me, I want to understand how we do that. How do we turn the tables? And I was reading, I was watching a TV show that was kind of talking about something, and the question they asked in this TV show stuck with me. Where does the magic reside? Right? Where does this capability reside? And this question, this slap on the face, eventually led me, and I had other questions as well, but this was at the root of it. it eventually led me to Boston University, and I went in the fall of 2002, I believe, and joined a PhD program there called Science, Philosophy, and Religion. And the entire assumption of that program was that the biggest questions that we ask require interdisciplinary thinking. We're not going to solve these kinds of big questions by just looking at one particular domain, particularly in terms of science, philosophy, and religion, all of which have claimed at certain times and at different ways to be picturing ultimate reality, right? So this program was designed to give absolute freedom to pursue a question in many different ways and to try to solve it. So I came there in the fall of 2002 with this question: where is the magic? What does it mean to be human? And I started filling out my schedule and taking classes. And I took classes in psychology and in neuroscience, philosophy of language, cognitive science, sociobiology. I'm probably missing a number of just sciences where I was looking to try to figure out where the magic was. How was it that we were able to turn the tables and know things about the world, even things that themselves don't know anything about anything, right? And as I started taking all these classes, I started seeing something that was bothering me. And it was sort of like a shell game. You know, those games where you hide a little coin or something under shells and you move the shells around and then you try to guess where the shell is. And it's never where you think it is if the person is good doing it. There was sort of a shell game going on here with this question that I was asking, because every field acknowledges that that's an important question, that it's part of what they want to try to answer. But then they bracket that question, and I think kind of assumed that that's for some other field to study. And what they attempt to do is look at the kind of sort of mindless, unconscious, determined bits like genes and memes or neurons or whatever else that is in their particular field's purview, and just focus on that. Let's just get good understanding of that in a scientific way, and not try to answer that bigger question, or at least not try to answer it now, right? And so after taking all these classes and realizing that I wasn't getting any closer to trying to answer my question about where this kind of magic is, I started getting pretty depressed. And I was actually about 4 years into my program at this point. And I had gone through I think I'd gone through my comprehensive exams, and I was kind of in that interim phase before you go into your dissertation. And I was getting lost and wasn't even sure what I wanted to do, because what I wanted to do was understand this aspect of humanity. And a friend of mine who I was telling this said, you know, you really need to read a book by a guy named Terrence Deacon. It's called The Symbolic Species. And that's actually the next book that I'll call up really quickly here. Now, this book was a revelation to me. This book changed everything. Because what Deacon was doing, and I would consider him one of the preeminent interdisciplinarians of our age, is that he was taking the work of a specific philosopher, a guy named Charles Peirce, who no one has ever heard of. He's an American philosopher. Very few people know of his work. But he was taking his work and applying it to his field, which is brain development, the evolutionary origin of human brains. He's a biological anthropologist, and he has a brain lab at Berkeley. And so he has, chimpanzee brains and bonobo brains and all these, he studies brains and how they develop over time. And what he did in this book was apply this philosophical theory to his understanding of brain development, and came up with this incredibly powerful theory about how the brain and language co-evolved. And I'll talk about this in just a second. The philosopher Peirce that he was working with was interested in developing what he called a theory of reference, how one thing can refer to another thing. For example, a word. How do words work? How does a word that you're hearing right now act as something like a sign that points you to something else. When I say yellow, you immediately go to yellow, right? You imagine yellow just pops up. You don't get stuck on the word, and the word doesn't make, it's not like it's physically, it's not making yellow appear in front of your eyes, but it's acting like a sign that points you to the color yellow. And if you think about it, that's very strange. Anything acting like a sign doesn't physically cause anything to happen in the world. For example, a stop sign, by virtue of its shape or color or whatever, it doesn't physically act on you in some way to make you stop when you pull up to it. Like most everything in the world that physically impinges upon you, right? A stop sign doesn't cause you to stop in the same way that physical things might cause you to stop. It somehow transfers something to you so that you stop. And Peirce was really fascinated with this. And he, part of the idea here is that meaning, whatever meaning is, whatever reference is, whatever words do when they're doing their thing, it doesn't seem to be a physical thing. And Deacon notices that you can use up energy, you can use up resources, but you can't use up the meaning of a sentence. The meaning of a sentence can be shared with thousands of readers without ever being depleted. And in fact, the more you share it, the more power it seems to have. And so in a scientific perspective, what kind of beast is meaning? And Peirce, of course, had a theory as to what was going on there, and Deacon takes that theory and applies it to the evolution of human brains. The argument basically goes that our brains have evolved using symbols and signs for so long that it's completely natural for a child when he's born to begin to look for signs and symbols in the world around him or her, to hear things and see things as other things. That part and parcel of what it means to be human is to be a sign user, to be looking for things that do what we do by nature, right? Use words and effortlessly learn languages. And after reading this book, I was convinced that something about this was really right, that this is where the magic resides. It's what gives us our power to use knowledge about things. And it has a kind of term, it has a word, but basically it's our ability to interpret the world that is so central to our humanity. And I realized after reading this book that I'm now leaving a wider world. I was kind of under the idea that I was going to stick with the sciences and do my dissertation and figure out what it means to be human. And I realized, you know what, I'm going to have to venture out and do more. I'm going to have to look at something like philosophy. I'm going to have to look at Peirce. I'm going to have to figure this stuff out. Okay, so that's sort of the introduction of how I started getting into my area of interest. And it's actually a natural stopping point. I'm not going to stop here, but this might be an opportunity for you to say, okay, that raises a question, or I have a thought here, and maybe jot it down, and we'll hopefully get to look at it later. So I started asking myself, okay, if Deacon is right, and if Peirce is right, and that somehow interpretation is critical to what it means to be human, I need to learn about this. And like everything I found out, there is an academic field already set up that studies that topic. And some of the things I learned as I began to investigate what interpretation is, was that I learned it's not a thing, but it's a process. It's something that makes connections between two things, or compares one thing to another thing in some way that makes a difference to the thing who's doing the comparing, who's doing the interpreting. So in an interpretation, there are always three things. There's the thing that we're referring to, I want this water bottle here. And then there's what we're saying about that thing, where it fits into our world picture, what it means to us, how we make sense of it. To my son, he's now 5, but when he was a baby, this meant something, but not what it means to me now, and not what it means to him now. This has changed its meaning over time, but it's still the same bottle of water, right? There's the thing that we're referring to. There's what we're saying about that thing and where it's fitting into our picture. And then there's the us, to whom it matters in some way. And how we interpret something changes our relationship to that thing. Interpretation is a different kind of connection between things than what's described in the sciences, where physical things impact other physical things according to, assumed invariant natural laws. Interpretation has to do with something that means something to someone in some respect, for some reason. And meaning, this idea of meaning, it's a particularly hard thing to get our heads around. So what I thought I'd do is I want to describe 2 or 3 instances of interpretation to give you a feeling, to give you a handle on what I'm talking about here. First, I'll say this: science itself is interpretation of certain elements in nature. We compare whatever it is we're investigating to a mental and usually mathematical model that we've created, and we hope that the comparison is a good one, and that the model allows us to say something like, this piece here without variation will cause this outcome here at some later time, or something like that. We hope that this tight mathematical model allows us to predict what's going to happen without any variation when we're looking at a particular phenomenon in nature. And so doing science has this 3-part element. There's some sort of mathematical or mechanical model we've created, F equals ma equals mc squared, etc. And then there's what the model is about, the phenomena in nature that we're trying to make sense of. And then there's the scientist who people slap on the back and give Nobel Prizes to for making particularly helpful models. Now, sometimes that Nobel Prize winner is easily forgotten when we're kind of making strong scientific claims about ultimate reality that themselves don't have any room for us in them. And I think this is what I was intuitively realizing that was happening when I was reading The Selfish Gene. That somehow what was being forgotten was the fact that by knowing this, it matters somehow to someone who isn't captured by that which is in the model. The model is useful for some end for someone. And so sometimes it's easy that we can get so wrapped up in our scientific theories that we forget that all modeling is an act of interpretation by someone who's able to do such a thing. So science then is a kind of interpretation that uses specialized mental signs like math to make sense of certain phenomena. But what else is interpretation? And this leads me to kind of the sub-theme of this lecture, which is about, I think it's something in the title, something like Between the Sciences and the Humanities, or something like that. And I think that's an apt title for what I'm trying to do here. But the humanities are acts of interpretation. What I mean by the humanities are academic disciplines like history and art, philosophy, religion, literature, music. The humanities are interpretation, but here they're not studying certain physical phenomena, but they're studying interpretation itself. How humans make sense of what it means to be human. And I'll give you an example from the field of history, because history is interpretation. Historians look back and offer a theory as to why these events happened and not those, but always with some perspective in mind, some assumptions about what are the kind of important things that actually do motivate people to do certain things or to make significant changes in some way. So when we look at history, or a historian looks at history, there's kind of a background assumption about what they're looking for that they assume is going to have explanatory value in the study. And here's what's really cool and interesting when you think about this. because history is interpretation, there's this whole other thing that historians do called historiography, which is when they look back at what older historians said when they were looking back at past events, in order to try to figure out what those historians thought was important or relevant when they were explaining why certain events happened. So the study of past historians in historiography gives us a window into the perspectives of different ages, into what they thought was important when they were interpreting past events. So historiography is sort of historical interpretation of historical interpretation. And I think that's just really cool. And the same is true about other humanities, fields like the academic discipline of art. My first art class, in fact, I think it's my only art class, I took as an undergrad at UVA. And it's the only class that I still remember from my undergraduate years, and that was a while ago. The reason why it was so impressive to me and why it stuck with me for so long, is that I had this idea that what I was going to be looking at is lots of pictures of art, and I was supposed to go, oh, that's really cool or beautiful, or oh yeah, I see how they did that. And it's like memorizing 1,000 pictures of art, and that's kind of what it's about. But it wasn't about that at all. It was the art history class, and this professor in particular was bringing out the assumptions and background thinking and ways of looking at the world that were buried in every ages and every different culture that we looked at, their artistic expression, how they were viewing the world that was hidden in the way that they were interpreting their experiences when they were making their art, when they made their art. And it turned out that this history of art was the best class on the history of Western civilization I ever took. It taught me more about how worldview shows up and changes and has these elements to it that morph over time than any other thing that I could possibly study, because art is the interpretation of interpretation, or art history is interpretation of interpretation. So if this is interesting at all to you, I want to suggest a book. I was trying to think what's a good intro book to this idea of interpretation that that's somewhat accessible. And I think this is the one that I would recommend. This is by Walker Percy. This is the Southern novelist, Walker Percy. He won awards as a novelist and everything. And his daughter was deaf, and he got very interested in how language works and how language works. And he wrote 2 books, this one and another one called Lost in the Cosmos, which basically investigates, and he discovered this philosopher Peirce and wrote all of these really interesting essays that are more designed for people like me when I was first getting into this, right, who didn't know much about it, and just pointing out how queer man is, how queer language is, and what one has to do with the other, right? So this is a book that I would recommend. Now, I want to kind of summarize where I've been so that I can pivot to where I'm going. And this is the only time I'm going to do this with like text on a screen. What I think I learned so far at this point in my academic career, and this is going back a ways a bit, the vast majority of events in the universe, like radioactive decay and the influence of the moon on the Earth, seem to be best described by mathematical languages where invariant, things that don't vary, causal relationships between variables are used, in other words, invariant models between variables are used to track physical entities as they interact or change over time. And that this is the huge discovery that defined the scientific revolution, that most of what we wanted to understand about the world was best done using this method. Galileo at one point said that it's just fascinating that the world seems to respond to math, that math is the language of the universe. And that is what I still am. So I have in my feed on my phone, I'm constantly reading the latest, scientific discoveries about quantum things, just because that's where I happen to be living right now. And, just it's just fascinating to me to see the hard work that all these people are doing to create these models that capture reality in some way. And then they try to break those models and find out where those models don't work so that they can revise them, doing this act of interpretation, of trying to make sense of the world. But most of the world kind of works best when we use this method. But then there are those extremely rare special events that at least we humans seem to do regularly, where we connect new experiences to some sort of mental map with the goal of making sense of them, fitting them into a meaningful world, which we then use in some way, like science. Some one thing is seen as something to some third thing, like you or me, or the scientist doing the work, or the historian looking at history. And this is called interpretation. In the field that studies it is called semiotics. So both the sciences and the humanities are examples of interpretation, and it's a distinctly human way of being in the world. Now, I want to say a word about the interdisciplinarity that freed me and allowed me to do this, because the beauty of having an interdisciplinary, or to having the freedom to be interdisciplinary at that point in my career, was that I was beginning to see kind of the vastly different ways that things can be looked at, and to begin to get some hints as to the way we can kind of juxtapose ideas and perspective against one another in search of something higher that gives us a greater perspective. And I think that this is kind of just the academic, interdisciplinarity, in other words, is kind of just the academic version of the idea that wisdom comes from having lots of life experiences that give you breadth so that you don't jump to conclusions and you don't become overly beholden to any one perspective or idea. And we try to ask what else might be important to consider. And interdisciplinarity gives someone who's pursuing it the ability to kind of measure things against each other and weigh things against each other and recognize where they fit together and where they don't fit together. And it was very important to me at this point in my career to be able to think about this. Okay, so now I've done a second thing that I really wanted to do, which is to talk about this idea of interpretation and how this initial idea I had after reading Richard Dawkins's book convinced me that what it means to be human means to be doing this thing called interpretation, and how really cool it is that we can do that. So I'm pausing kind of because it's a good time to, to stop and digest for a second. I think if I was doing this in a class, I would probably stop right there and it would be a break for discussion. So, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to press on because I want to take you to where the next pivot in my thinking. Because then the question became, what is responsible for the difference between what most of the universe is doing and what we're doing? How does the stuff described by the sciences, which doesn't seem to be interpreting, the world in the way that we are, how does that stuff become the stuff like us that does? Were human minds the first to do this, for example? And if so, what is it about our minds that enables this to happen? Do we know anything else that interprets what's outside of it for its own ends and pleasures and its own pursuits? Or is this a one-off, or is this part of something that's happening in nature and other places as well? And so the next big turning point was discovering, authors and thinkers who were arguing that biology, that living things, fits into this picture here. Because on the face of it, living things are doing something very different than anything else that's studied by the sciences. And actually, I'll share one more book that's again, here my goal is to continue to give you a sense for the journey. This was a book that I read. This is by a physicist. He's a pretty famous physicist named Paul Davies. It's called The Fifth Miracle: The Search for the Origin and Meaning of Life. And in the basic gist, I mean, he covers a lot of ground. He's one of those thinkers that thinks big. But the gist of the idea is his bafflement as a physicist when trying to interpret what's going on with biology, right? It does things, he talks about you can throw a clod of dirt in the air and using certain laws, you're gonna be able to tell pretty much where it's going to land. But if that clod happens to be a bird, or it's a rodent and there's cats in the room, all bets are off. You're not going to, no law of physics is going to tell you what's going to happen to that thing flying through the air at that moment. And it wasn't so much the answers in this book that he offers, because it kind of resides more in his sense of unsettlement. But this was a really helpful book for me because it started framing the question in the right way, and I highly recommend it. And in a funny kind of twist, this impacted me so much that when I was at BU, he came to speak at Harvard, and I went to hear him speak. And afterwards, I had this book. It was all beat up, and I think I still have it on my shelf here. And I had him sign it and everything. And I explained how important it was. Well, he's at ASU now, and I'm actually a part of the lab that he runs. So I've done all sorts of things with him now. So it's kind of a cool, turn of events. So the question here is that biology, in fact, let me tell you a story. I was just at a dissertation defense last week in philosophy of biology. A friend of mine who was a former student had worked his way through the honors program that I used to teach in, and he was now defending his dissertation in philosophy of biology. And he was making an argument, something similar to what I'm saying here, that biology has this element of interpretation in it. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. And at a dissertation defense, there's a panel of professors whose job is to not let anyone get off easy, to not let some claim that doesn't hold water just hang there, but rather to challenge it and make sure that this person can back up what they're saying. So when the student said, there, this potential PhD said this, one of the professors there said, wait a minute. From where I sit, and I study ants, I study nematodes, I study very small things that have very small brains. When I study these things, all I see is physical causality. I see what a biochemist sees because what I'm studying is biochemistry. The neurons in a nematode have been completely mapped. We know exactly what will happen if you touch anything, what the response will be. There's nothing unknown in this. There's no interpretation. This is a simple matter of the working out what's going on in a physical system. I don't understand what you mean by this interpretation stuff. And the discussion, took some twists and turns, but the gist of the response to this person, and this person is correct in that what he's looking at is a single organism at a single point in time. But when you look like Darwin did over a line of organisms, I'm going to say a line of organisms, what I mean, another word I'll say is a lineage of organisms. I mean, like, one generation begets the next generation, begets the next generation. If you look at a lineage of organisms over evolutionary time, you begin to see this idea of interpretation where diverging lines of organisms are differently interpreting their environment. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But a nice picture of this is that an endless diversity of living things is discovering an endless diversity of ways to make a living in the world biologically. And I'm reminded of that great line in Jurassic Park, life finds a way. The guy who put together the park is, the people that he brought to the park to criticize it are saying, how are you going to control this? What's going to happen when the dinosaurs break out or whatever? And he says, oh, no, we've got it completely controlled. There's no way it could happen. And the response of the mathematician who's criticizing him says, life finds a way. Life has a way of using constraints in its environment for its own ends. Now, why is this? Why would I say that this is interpretation? if interpretation is making connections between two things or comparing one thing to another thing in some way that makes a difference to the thing doing the comparing, then a line of reproducing biological organisms are defined by this very trait. Tiny variations in their internal instructions for making bodies, that what DNA does, it makes a body, have their results compared to the environment the organisms find themselves in. And over time, these tiny variations that represent sort of experiments, some of them fail, and some zero in on those that work, or the lineage zeroes in on those that work. A lineage of organisms has been interpreting variations in its environment and exploring possibilities in its environment way before we started interpreting things in our environment. Now, there's a difference. Living things aren't doing it with foresight or with intentions the way we might, right? But the process that allows a lineage of organisms, and I won't go into the details here, but the process that allows that lineage to differ and explore and then learn from that differing. No individual does this, but over the lineage it does. It allows that lineage this ability to interpret. And that's what accounts for kind of the mind-like capability of biological evolution. It's why it's natural to think that some sort of mind is responsible for biological fitness, right? That was the default position, not just in the Christian West, but all over, that living things represent a kind of mind, because how else could they be so beautifully connected to their environment? And the point from the perspective of semiotics, that's because they are exhibiting over their lineage, over their time, mind-likeness. And I was really struck, well, I'll save some of the details. There are details here that I'd be happy to go into, but there's a whole field that studies this, by the way. And one little thing that I was struck by was a phrase by a philosopher named Donald Campbell, a philosopher of biology, who noted that the pincers of a beetle are almost perfectly designed according to Archimedes' law of levers. The law of levers is that thing that, you put something on a fulcrum, and depending on where it is on the fulcrum, you can lift a lot of heavy things, or you can do all sorts of things with it. And he realized that in the DNA of that beetle is an encoded set of signs that if you know how to read it, are referring to the success of that law to moving stuff, right? That if you could read DNA in a beetle, somewhere in there is Archimedes' law of levers expressed. Well, how does that kind of intelligence happen over time? Well, that's what biosemiotics is all about. Now, this might be new to you, and there might be all sorts of questions about it, that's fine, but this is my point. Here we're beginning to see something like an argument for how unthinking, unpurposeful, law-behaving activity of the majority of the things in the universe described by science allow for something that can include us to show up. It's like biology has one foot in the biochemistry that this one professor was saying, that's all I see. And it has another foot over these long periods of evolutionary time where it's doing something that's beginning to look like what we do when we're interpreting things. Now, I would say that notice again that this can't be done from one perspective or from within one academic discipline. It really requires adventurous thinkers kind of going outside of their field and delving into different areas in order to try to make sense of this stuff. And I'm going to assess here. We're 42 minutes in. Okay. So what I think,
Paul,
yes.
Take your time if you need it. Feel free.
Thank you. But at the same time, I don't want to, hey, we all got lives. Okay. So what I will do is this. I'll just point to this. I won't get into it a lot. But another thinker, key pivot point. Douglas Hofstadter. This guy, talk about an interdisciplinarian. He has chairs at the University of Indiana in physics, computer science, cognitive science, comparative literature, and I think math, but I'm not 100% on the math. And notice that the comparative literature here is an interesting mix when you're talking about the hard sciences and something that's thinking in terms of language and comparison. He's written many books on interpretation and how we translate from one language to another. This idea of comparison is big in his thinking. And this book on the left, Gödel, Escher, and Bach, got the Pulitzer Prize. It was in the 70s. It is a hoot. Man, it's one of the funnest books you'll ever read. He purposely tries to make it fun. There's all these things in it that if you look, like he had control over the typesetting of the book. So he'll do all these things like the first letter of every word, whatever's the left-hand word on the page, the first letter, if you read up and down it, it's saying something to you. Or there are all these weird kinds of patterns to try to make his point about the crazy way. And his ultimate point here in both of these books is that what life is doing and what minds are doing share a similar dynamic. And it's a fantastically interesting thing to explore. So I'll just gesture at it. I won't go into the details. And again, these will be available at the end. Okay, so I want to briefly say something about the human level, what's happening in our own minds in the way we use language. Again, I'm just going to point to the books and I'll briefly describe them. I've mentioned the Symbolic Species here on the left, but I want to point to another one by a person named Merlin Donald called A Mind So Rare. Both of these are just fascinating accounts of what language does to a human and how the fact that we've evolved within language creates worlds that we don't even know are there because we're so thoroughly living in them like a fish in water that we don't recognize this incredible feature of what it means to be human. It means to live in worlds that were constructed by language. And these are both of these are fascinating books that permanently changed the way I think about things. So I'll just leave it at that. What both of these people point out is that language acts like a series of constraints, things that, like shackles, but good shackles, that constrain otherwise possible but uncoordinated ways of thinking. And because we share language, we share those constraints. And it pushes our minds together towards ideas that others have found, and that a culture has found over time to be particularly productive or inventive in some way. And it allows individuals to share a consistent and common view of the world and modify it as needed. We humans have created this vast, interconnected set of interpretations of our experience by creating and then constantly tinkering with the way our words map onto the realities that we live. And then we pass this map on to our young, who use it to further explore. They push it further, the possibility space of being human in the world. Every generation faces the fact that at some point, the world has changed from the way it was when they grew up. Right? I'm 56 and I've just realized the world is changing under my feet. The world I grew up in is not the world that is right now, and it's disorienting. Both good and bad things from the past are lost, and new things are found. I think there's hope in this too, by the way, because the process tends to be self-regulating, because we actually try out these models corporately in our cultures. We live these models, and then we learn lessons like the reign of terror and National Socialism. Yeah, maybe not so good. What can we learn from going down those routes, right? I mean, these things happen like that. But the point is that language becomes this thing that creates something like a human species. We're humanity. We're more than just individuals, but we're something that shares mind because we share the same constraints in our minds in order to channel us productively and with each other together. It coordinates us in a powerful way. And I want to mention one important thing, because this is something I only learned recently about what universities do and why I found a home at a university in teaching and doing research. And it's basically because universities are the gatekeepers of these shared mental maps that humanity across time and space has been using through language. And we store it, we protect it, we save the old, we measure it against each other, we compare things to each other. All these interpretations of the natural world, the social world, the psychological world, the world of speculative metaphysics. Humanity has been doing this for a long time, and universities are like great storehouses where all sorts of experiments are done on those, and tries to make sense of it and tries to say what we should keep and what we should get rid of and what we should change and how and why. And it's just a fascinating, it's an honor to be a part. I only realized this as I was getting hooded with my, in that ceremony when I was becoming a PhD, that I'm now being asked to be one of the gatekeepers of human thought, right? This is bigger than my own little dissertation or my own field, right? This is something that I'm invested in because it's an honor, it's a responsibility. So it's just a plug for what universities do. And the last thing I want to say about language is it creates possibilities that just don't exist physically, and that we then live in, coordinating our lives by them. Your dog just couldn't live in or understand what it means, what a corporation like IBM is, or what the United States of America is, or what the border with Mexico is, or what legal tender is. All of these are social mapped constructs. They're legal entities. They have reality because we agree that they do. The bird, there is no United States of America. Google Maps shows it. Google Earth does not, right? Same with the border of Mexico. The buildings that people from IBM use in whatever, New York, right? They're not the buildings and it's not the people, but it's this legal entity that continues to exist and that we people participate in. Money has its power, not because of anything that it is, but because of our commitment to it, our faith in it, right? And sometimes that faith is broken. I ask my students all the time to kind of challenge them about this, like, what happened when the stock market crashed in 1929 and people took their lives and the world fell apart? What actually happened? Did anything physically change? I mean, did the food stop producing? Was there, what physically happened when the stock market crashed? We say something crashed. Well, what fell down? I mean, it wasn't food production. It wasn't all of these things, but it was our faith in this key element of the mental map that we had organized our lives by. And the collapse of that faith brought profound and real physical changes to people all over the world, right? The effect of the fall of the crash was real. But what crashed was not something physical. It was our collective faith in something. And our world, that's part of the theme of the books that I was pointing to, but how our world is socially constructed. And a great book that I'm reading right now that talks about this, and Yair, I promise I'm just about done. I'm 52 minutes in. Is this book right here. I haven't read the whole book, so I can't vet everything, but I'm reading it right now, and I think it's either the second or the third chapter, spends the entire chapter just investigating the ways that language allows us to construct the social world that we live in, that we just assume is physical, it's real. But it's not, it's this mental construct, and it's the way language is coordinating all our minds to do these very efficient, productive, coordinated group things together. It's fascinating in that respect. Okay, I think I'm closing up here, because the last thing I want to point to is this, is where did I finally end up after pursuing all this? And the picture I want to leave with you is something like, you know, those Russian dolls that you open one and then there's another and there's another and there's another. The idea here is that there seem to be emerging levels of interpretation that have happened in the universe, at least on the planet Earth, right? Interpretation first arose in biology as chemistry became biochemistry, and over the course of evolution began to explore its environment and conform itself and inhabit new niches that it never did before. And later, within certain subset of biological organisms, some sort of mental sentience, minds, brains that weren't just programmed but had more elements to them arose, allowing them a different kind of interpretation that wasn't dependent on waiting for the genes to catch up, but allowed an animal like my dog or whatever to evaluate in the moment, right? And then in an even smaller subset of animals, language showed up, further changing this dynamic and creating these vast things called civilizations that share mind in an important way and coordinate behavior in a way that's unthinkable to an animal without language. The basic gist of this idea is that more can be different, right? That the natural processes described by the sciences can become stable at different levels of systematic organization. I know that's big language talk here, but it's the idea here is something like the cast of characters that are described, you know, the standard model of particle physics breaks down everything into certain, there's a cast of characters. This is what the world is made of. Well, that cast of characters can become constrained in their interactions with each other, such that organization and systematic behavior and even intelligence and self-maintenance over time can arise. And this is what opens the door for comparison and interpretation. And the details as to how this happens, to me, represents one of the real cutting edges of science. And the very last book I'll leave with you is the one that's currently inhabiting the world I live in now, right? This is the book that sort of is where I live, even if I haven't read it in a while, but it's this book here, Incomplete Nature. This is again by Terrence Deacon, the brain guy. How Mind Emerged from Matter. And it's basically a history of the cosmos in an attempt to figure out how these processes actually work and how things that interpret their world, like us, arose from things that don't. And what's fascinating about this let me just try to say it like this. The importance of being interdisciplinary is that it helps us to remember these vast connections between everything. Now, it goes without saying that disciplinary specialization was and is critical to giving insight into, you know, local and focused pieces of the puzzle. Without that sort of specialization, we wouldn't be able to figure out anything at all on how these pieces fit together. We need disciplinary specialization. But interdisciplinarity builds upon the specializations and try to see how these connections between things happen. It helps us remember, A, that we're not toiling in obscurity as we're, you know, pursuing the left, or I have a friend who's a specialist in the E-ring of Saturn. And he waited for 15 years or something like that for the design of the Cassini space probe to get finished and launched and end up at Saturn. And because he was the world expert in the E-ring of Saturn, it was a field day when that thing finally got there. Well, he's not toiling in obscurity by just focusing in on that little detail, because there's a bigger picture. And we need each other's perspectives, and that no one perspective or no one interest should dominate everything else. Knowledge and growth and interpretation is a human-wide phenomenon and project. We all need to be participating in it. And the last image I have is a friend of mine who I think is at this lecture, was a writer for National Geographic. I was a big fan of that magazine, and oh, you're a writer there. And he left that to try to do some work and try to write some things that he thought would be significant. And I asked him, well, why? What's the goal here? And he gave me a picture that I've never forgotten. And he says, you know, it's like there's this pile of rocks that represent all of the different things that all of different people through humanity have added to our picture. And some of them fell off, and most people don't even add anything, but, or they add, I shouldn't say that. But the point is that this pile represents the past in a way. And his goal was to add his little rock to that pile in the hope that somehow it fit into this bigger picture. And that's kind of the beauty of what I'm trying to say. That's why I do what I do, is to try to put my little rock in there as well. So that's all I got as an official sense. And I'm 60 minutes, so I'm sorry, Yair, that was too long, but I tried.
That's totally fine. We have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. Join me in a round of applause. Paul, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. And I'd like to go straight to Q&A. If anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand electronically. We have a few issues with the chat box, so we can't ask questions in writing. So please feel free to raise your hand electronically, and we'll let you ask a question. Let's start with Lexi.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Paul, thank you. This is really interesting. I too am I'm an engineer with a strong interest in social sciences, and I was just wondering whether your early training in engineering at all affected the way that you were thinking about any of these topics. I heard you mention a bunch of other disciplines, but did that have any impact on just like your line of thinking and your thought progression as you explore these things?
That's a great question. And the answer is, I would say, is profoundly. And the reason why, you can hear me? I'm not muted, right? Okay.
Yeah.
The reason why is that what engineering taught me, and it taught me the unforgiving nature of reality. I was laughing with Yair before this meeting about what a failure I was as an astronomical engineer, because it turned out that my skill set just wasn't right, it wasn't correct for the kind of attention to detail and long-term painstaking work that's required. I had a friend who was a mechanical engineer who was doing his PhD for a professor, and it took him like 6 years just to get the experimental setup right? He failed so many times. And there's something that's so humbling about actually having to try to manipulate the physical world in productive ways. There's no tolerance of your sloppy thinking, right? And I sort of really realized from the get-go that I was not going to be satisfied with pie in the sky, or, I talked about interpretation a lot, but I had a real problem with it when I first discovered it. And I did actually one of my third examinations for my PhD just on Terrence Deacon's argument as to why he thought interpretation was going on in a certain field and what it meant. I spent probably 6 months just pulling out that argument because I wanted to understand, because I felt like too much was at stake to just say, oh, that's cool, I'm moving on. Okay, I got it. Interpretation, all right. I wanted to know if it was true. I wanted to make sure it was true, to the degree that I could, right? And that was something that came to me from my MIT days. From the very first second that the semester started at MIT till the second I turned in my last exam, I was terrified. I was a nervous wreck. I was riddled with anxiety, because I'll tell you, I don't know if this is still true, but in the 80s, MIT was a horrific, terrifying place to be. I mean, it was no mercy. It was just like the best of the best. And boy, you found out really quick where you ranked on that scale. But the point is that humbling, right, was, and also that desire to get it right as best I could, right? That was something that fed me. I don't think I would be a decent interdisciplinarian now if I hadn't embodied, if I hadn't kind of learned that lesson, so that I'm not satisfied with kind of half-assed, gesturing, hand-waving answers, but rather I want to know, no, does this actually work? Right? Can we actually bet on this? And that was kind of, so yeah, I think it affected me profoundly in precisely the way that I'm trying to say right here.
Thank you, Lexi. And Ben Imadali, and after that, Allah, is that how I should call you? Great, so Ben first.
Sure. Hey, Dr. Cassell. Thanks, that was awesome. I'm curious, kind of on a lighthearted note and also just a two-part question. How often did irony and humor and absurdity come up in your sort of explorations through this stuff? And also, how often did you observe that affecting people's judgment, like as humans trying to make sense of all of this?
That's an interesting question. Okay, I don't know if I can speak to irony and absurdity other than, but I have something else that I have for you. So I have something. Yeah, I'll say this. I read, well, I have it on my shelf. This book that's this thick called The History of Western Philosophy. I took a directed study where I plowed through this entire volume that's this big. I did not laugh once until I think it was the next to last, little snippet that was William James's, and I don't remember it was something by William James, and I realized this guy's funny. He actually has a sense of humor, and because I was in this tome of dead philosophers, right? It was like this I guess I had a sort of, what do you call those moments where all of that pent up frustration came out when I was reading William James. But here's what I would say. I don't know so much about irony and absurdity, but I will say something important about play. Because I think a lot of what happens that's profound happens when we're loosening our grip on something and just being more playful with it, allowing it to sort of not be what it is, or what we think it is, or what we thought it was, but allow it to be something that it could be that we'd never even thought of. Play is important. In Peirce, the philosopher that I was mentioning, has a whole theory of play that it's critical to you have to loosen your hold in order for new possibilities to be imagined. I kind of playing off of that, I came up with a whole theory about how humans originally stumbled onto symbolic thinking that involves a kind of playfulness, because I think that's how fundamental change happens, or fundamental revision of thinking happens. And I'll say, in biology, in terms of investigating the origins of life, which is something I'm actually very interested in, that's what I do with Paul Davies. One of the thinking that's become really critical is realizing that when, genes and reproduction, that's a high stakes thing. But whenever somehow a whole set of genes gets duplicated for some odd, weird reason, that whole set is free to explore things. It's not under the burden of carrying the weight of reproduction of the species. It can play. It can do all sorts of interesting things, and that's where really massive variation probably came from in the history of the origin of life. And I haven't figured it out. Well, who has figured it out completely? But I'm thinking that play is actually a critical thing. So it's not quite absurdity or irony, but it is something in that neighborhood that I think is really important.
Thank you, Ben. Allah, and then Jonathan Morgan.
Thank you for your very nice presentation. So, for having this ability that human being has it. Is it random for you or is it a gift?
Well, let me say, between random and gift, there's a third thing as well. And part of what to me is so fascinating about the course of study that I did was asking this question about how these interactions begin to become something that is meaningful, something that is significant beyond what they were prior. It's kind of this idea that there's this growth in not all domains but of the universe, but in some, that leads to something that can lead to something that takes on more meaning. I mean, that's the whole point of that. The subtitle of that book is how mind comes from matter, how matter becomes mind, right? And not that mind is the end all be all, but there is something about the growth of value that's occurring in the universe as we currently know it, right? It might not be forever, and maybe we're just a local pocket. But the point is that there seems to be some growth of value that is worth noting. I don't know if I'd use the word gift, only because it kind of implies that there has to be an intelligence outside of it giving the gift. Whereas I think that what I think I'm more comfortable with is the idea that that idea can come in through nature itself. That the idea of gift, this might not go exactly, I don't even know where this is going exactly. But the point is that I think that there's an interesting, we don't have to think in terms of huge, the fundamental thing I'm trying to say in terms of my own discoveries where I am now is we don't have to think in terms of binaries, random or mind permeates all or something like that. But rather, what we can do is explore the way something that moves in this direction is actually occurring in nature. Now, you can ask bigger metaphysical questions about, well, why do we live in a universe where that might occur? And those are completely legitimate kinds of questions. They're just not the kinds of questions I'm trying to answer or trying to ask in my own work. I don't know if I've hit it exactly what you're trying to say, but that would be my kind of attempt to comment on that. Maybe someone else has a better idea of.
Thank you, Ella, for that question. And we'll move on to Jonathan, followed by Allison and Rhoda.
Thank you.
Jonathan.
All right, thanks, Yair, and thank you, Paul. Very fascinating. I got a question. I might have missed it. I have a baby upstairs who doesn't know how to interpret bedtime, so it was very poor semiotic system right now. My question is about the social sciences. I feel like a lot of your examples are sort of drawing from, astrophysics or quantum physics and these other sort of chemistry where like the mathematical modeling of things is a little more precise, and like you were talking about sort of unchanging. And I guess I work within social psychology, and I feel like that's this area where both the humanities and the sciences have a lot to say about anything that you're looking at and have really different interpretations of phenomenon. And so I was just curious to hear your thoughts or some of your experiences of teams kind of working in this intersection where one group's trying to bring this mathematical perspective and mathematize everything, and the other group is like very sensitive to that and is working more with interpretation. And how do those get along? Is there always a gap between them? Are there ways to find some working together?
That's it's a great question. It's a very live question, right? So I would consider, if I had a single field, I mean, I'm technically religious studies, but the work I'm most familiar with, honestly, is biological anthropology. And so my mentor, Terry Deacon, right? He is a biological anthropologist at Berkeley, and he had to take the chair. He was in a political situation where he had to take the chair of the Department of Anthropology because the war between those who were thinking about anthropology from more of a scientific perspective and those who were thinking of it from more of a humanities perspective was so intense that he felt like he was going to be excluded, or somehow that his work, I don't know what he thought the consequences were, but he felt like he had to, step in and speak for himself by becoming the chair of the department. And that kind of tension between those that would try and, I don't want to say reduce, because it's not, I don't think the people who are doing it are trying to reduce it, but there's always a tension between the way we're thinking, how do I put it? So I think the way forward is something like what was happening at that biology conference, or that philosophy of biology dissertation defense that I was at, where it's possible to acknowledge the aspects of things that are studied by a particular field that do fall under a scientific kind of a mathematical formulation that best fall under. Here's the trick though. Is this best understood that way, or is this best understood this way, right? It depends on what we're talking about. In biology, if you're looking at a particular organism at a particular level of organization, the best way might be to look at it as this professor who I know well looked at the nematode and say, this is biochemistry, baby. That's all it is. We don't need to look at these other things. But that's not all there is in that field that's going on. And it has this whole other dimension of history and past that you cannot not interpret. It has to be interpreted. There's interpretation is built into it. Historical narrative is built into it. And so I have a feeling that in other fields like the social sciences, which are, in my opinion, torn, like I would love to say that they can productively act as sciences about humanity. And I think that they try to do that well. I would consider, like I said, a biological anthropologist is to me, kind of what I would consider myself to most be. I think that the tension is real because what we're talking about are two very different. Nature itself has these gradations. Human nature has these gradations. What's really uncomfortable for me, given the position I'm in, is when I go to consciousness conferences, where neurosciences are getting up and doing really powerful stuff about how certain things are, man, this is no, these are this series of neurons firing, blah, 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 and this reduces to that, right? That feels disorienting to me because I've spent so much time focusing on this interpretive area. But they're not necessarily either ors, right? That's the point I'm trying to say. I'm looking at from the lesson from that dissertation. These are not necessarily either ors, because what's happening, it's not like, well, I think that's what I'm trying to say. These are not either ors, but it's hard. And I understand why people fall off the balance being one way or the other. And all I could say is that the challenge is to try to walk it true to both, right? To not lose sight of either. It's very hard to do, but it's real.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan.
And so I'm curious, I unfortunately also had something else calling me a different way for a majority of the conversation. So I don't know what was missed. And if this is even that relative of a question within your field, but still really curious about what you, your mentors, and other people in those fields might say about the intersections of neuroscience, trauma, and the prevalence of trauma histories in historically oppressed identities under your study of systems theory, evolution, and ritual.
So, actually, I have a friend who what you just asked is his bread and butter. In fact, I one time tried to introduce you to him. I don't know if you remember this. I said, you need to call so-and-so. So what's interesting about what you're describing is the reality that trauma is both an interpretation and a physical thing, right? It shows up in many dimensions of, it affects the human person at many levels. Brain injury, it does the same thing, right? There's this interesting relationship between the stuff that's treated by a medicine, perhaps, for example, I'm just using that as one example, and the stuff that's treated by a reinterpretation of the narrative that one has told themselves, right? The narratives that we tell ourselves are incredibly important. And I teach a whole class, it's unrelated to what I'm talking about today, where one of the main goals is to help my students understand that their self-narrative is defining what they think is possible and who they think they are in a way that is so all-encompassing that to be able to recognize that and step out of it a little bit can be really freeing and really helpful. Not always, but because sometimes that causes all sorts of fractures of personality. But the point is, when there's been real trauma in a person's life, the narratives that what that means, it can mean different things. It can mean, oh, you really got physically hurt in a certain way that has affected it and had a long-term impact. Or it can mean you have turned something into a narrative that is having ongoing repercussions on how you see what the world, whether the world is good or bad, or whether there's hope for you or whether there's not, right? Narrativity and our self-interpretations are critically important for people and for groups, right? It really matters the stories that we tell and that how we interpret our experiences. And it also, though, has this physical component, right? It's not enough just to change the narrative. Sometimes things have to change physically as well. So there's that interplay there. But I think that's, if there's anything that's coming out as a theme here, is that what I've learned, I think, in all this, is that it's kind of an always both and sort of thing with regard to that which is best addressed by kind of lower level domains, and that which is best addressed by interpretation and the ways that we can revise what we're saying about things. I just know for myself that it's been very helpful to recognize the degree to which my narratives are mine.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Connor, do you want to ask a question? We still have a few minutes, maybe last question before we wrap it up.
Sure. Paul, great to see you. Thanks for the talk. I'd love to hear what you have to say about the connection between your work and work in embodied approaches to cognition, because you're talking about things like biological systems as information processors, and adapting to an environment as being sort of part of what cognition is. That's the processing of information. So which kind of points to it points to like an embodiment of thinking, right? That you couldn't really do what we think of as thinking unless you're kind of like situated in a body that's a complex system that's engaging with an external reality, both at an informational level and also at a physical level. So I'm thinking about books like Autopoiesis and Cognition by Thompson and Varela or Maritana and those guys, which is not important who they are, just that there's this way of dealing with cognitive science that's sort of embodied, and I'd love to hear if you've tackled that and how.
I had a hard time getting my hand around this idea of relations, how relations here represent relations here, but which is the heart of a kind of interpretive approach. But I guess what I'm saying is, in biology, for example, what we're interested in are the relationships between what nucleic acids are representing in the protein world and how those nucleic acids get arranged in such a way that they allow that biological being to engage with that protein realm. So that, to me, the most fundamental embodied cognition is the interpretive, it's what's happening in biological evolution. It's for things without brains, right? Like not cognition at the level of brains, but cognition at the level of ongoing processing and interactions with, and keeping a mapping relationship between something in one area that somehow represents, like that was Donald Campbell's thing about the law of levers being inside the DNA, that if you knew how to read DNA, you could see the law of levers in the DNA of a beetle because it's there. It was discovered. And so somehow cognition is a series of relationships that plays out in a different domain through physicality, and then get some feedback in some way. That's the heart of this interactive. I think that's what you mean by embodied cognition. And I think that's what the literature probably means, but that's at least my best attempt to try to address that question.
One book comes to mind that you actually had on the slide, Paul, A Mind So Rare by Merlin Donald, really talks about how human cognition is reformatted vis-a-vis changing technologies like communication technologies, that whole embodied situated cognition, fascinating thing that happens, I assume, mainly to humans on a whole different level for humans. But we're out of time. I really want to thank everyone for joining us. Before I let you go, one last round of applause for Dr. Cassell. Thank you so much. Paul, you said you'll make some of the links or bibliography available. We can post it on our website as well. Yeah. And I hope to see everyone soon again next month in our next monthly lecture. Thank you again, everyone. Take good care. Good night. See you again soon. Bye.